people think that goes away in April with the heat. Welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Licciardello.
This week, Joe Biden says Trump's refusal to accept defeat could cost lives. We'll look at what a transition should look like with the head of Obama's effort.
Plus, just how bad were those 2020 polls? And as this is the last show of the year, we're going to tell you what to look out for in the weeks ahead. But first...
2 weeks today after the US presidential election, and here's where things stand. Former Vice President Joe Biden has a little under 79 million votes. President Donald Trump, a little over 73 million. A national margin of just over 3.5 percentage points to Biden, and an electoral college advantage of 306 to Biden, 232 to Trump.
And for those keeping track, 306 electoral votes, according to 2016 Kellyanne Conway, was a landslide, a blowout, and historic. And the president felt that the Democrats at the time should have been focused on building up the country, not wasting everyone's time and energy on bullshit. Because 306 electoral college votes meant Trump was overwhelmingly elected. So I presume now, John, that he's saying pretty much the same thing, yeah?
You presume incorrectly, Chaz. This week, the president has been maintaining...
I won the election.
Because he says it was the...
most fraudulent election in history.
And that's a message being amplified by Trump supporters on Fox News.
What we're about to tell you is accurate. It's not a theory, it happened and we can prove it.
Did it though? Tucker has been focusing on a few specific cases, like Deborah Jean Christensen of Georgia.
Those who knew her were sad when she died last May, and they might be surprised to learn that even after her death, Deborah Jean Christensen still managed to register to vote and then cast a ballot, presumably for Joe Biden.
Now, Tucker doesn't explain why he presumes Deborah voted for Biden. Let's not worry about that, though. The Trump campaign also says voter records show somebody used the identity of Mrs. Deborah Jean Christensen of Roswell, Georgia, to vote in the recent election, even though Mrs. Christensen passed away in May 2019. And that much is true. She did indeed die in May last year. But did she vote after she died, or did somebody else use her name to vote illegally? No. Fulton County, Georgia officials have confirmed this week Mrs. Christensen voted for the last time in 2018, when she was alive. Her voter registration was cancelled in 2019 after she died. They have no records of sending her an absentee ballot this year, and that, quote, any claims of fraudulent participation in the November 3 general election in Mrs. Christensen's name appear to be false. The Trump campaign also claims somebody used the identity of James Blaylock of Covington, Georgia, to cast a ballot in the election, even though Blaylock died in 2006. And here's the culprit.
He's not voted. He didn't vote.
It was you.
It was me.
Caught red-handed, a 96-year-old democracy-destroying vote fraudster. Or was she?
Agnes Blaylock voted using her married name, Newton County confirmed. Her voter registration was signed as Mrs. James E. Blaylock Jr., and that's exactly how she signed her name when she voted in the November 3rd general election.
The President of the United States was accusing you of voter fraud, essentially.
Oh, I know it. And I knew it wasn't fraud.
No, it wasn't fraud. She's almost 100, and she still refers to herself officially as Mrs. James Blaylock. Old school, sure, and completely legal. As Tucker Carlson says...
It's hard to trust anything you hear right now.
Truth, Tucker. But here's where the rubber really hits the road. With these allegations turning to dust, just how badly does Donald Trump want a recount in places like Wisconsin? Unofficial results there show Joe Biden leading by in excess of 20,000 votes, well above the 0.25% threshold for a recount that the state of Wisconsin will pay for. So Trump would have to cover the full cost, $7.9 million up front. They have until tomorrow to decide on that, Chaz.
I can think of a whole lot of people who would want that recount to occur, John, but I don't think they're going to be getting a lot of joy. Recounts can change the tally. It's true. In fact, just this week, the recount in Georgia found 2,600 uncounted ballots that hadn't been uploaded to the ballot scanning machine, and they were worth about 800 net votes for Trump. But the margins in this election are just too big. Between 2000 and 2015, there were 27 recounts. They had an average swing of 282 votes. The biggest swing? 1,247 votes. But the lead in Georgia is about 14,000. So good luck there. Trump, of course, doesn't see things that way. He's tweeting that the so-called Republican Secretary of State won't let people check the signatures on the ballots for fraud, and without that, the whole recount process is unfair and close to meaningless. But he's wrong. The signature checking process in Georgia is actually extremely thorough. They verify signatures not just on ballots, but on absentee ballot applications as well. They then match those signatures to both a driver's license and a voter registration card, and then they cross-reference the ballot signature to the absentee ballot application signature. And as for checking those signatures now, the signatures aren't actually on the ballots themselves. They're on the envelopes that the ballots came in. And once a ballot is approved, it's separated from the absentee ballot envelope because it's meant to be a secret ballot. So of course you can't go back now and match people's identities to their vote. Now, as conservative writer Henry Olsen noted, if Trump had a problem with any of that, his campaign could have observed the signature matching process before the election, when it occurred. If he didn't like the procedures, he could have sued. But of course, the reason Trump ignored the Georgia process before was probably because he thought he was going to win. And now we've got Lindsey Graham allegedly suggesting to the Republican Secretary of State that if they can't match precise ballots and signatures, then maybe where counties were found to have higher rates of non-matching signatures, they could just throw out all the mail-in ballots. Sounds kind of desperate and dubious to me, and it's not going to happen. Talking about things that aren't going to happen, Trump's also tweeted that 700,000 ballots weren't allowed to be viewed in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, which means, based on America's great Constitution, he wins the state of Pennsylvania. That's not how the Constitution works. And this is what the Republican commissioner in Philadelphia, Al Schmidt, had to say.
The president says observers were not allowed in the counting rooms. Is that true?
That's totally untrue.
I guess he's so-called Republican as well. Remember, even Trump's lawyers in court admitted last week that Republican poll watchers were allowed in the vote counting area. And even if they had been kept out, you just recanvass the votes. You don't throw out 700,000 perfectly fine ballots. Either way, Pennsylvania's Secretary of State has already denied Trump a recount, so that ain't going to happen either. Then there's the claim Trump made last week on Twitter, but not in court, I might add, that Dominion election machines had been manipulated to change the recorded totals. I'll let One American News Network explain.
Election systems across the U.S. are found to have deleted millions of votes cast for President Trump. According to an unaudited analysis of data obtained from Edison Research, states using Dominion voting systems may have switched as many as 435,000 votes from President Trump to Joe Biden.
Except Edison Research, who was cited in that report there, said it is hard to respond to these reports that not only have no legitimacy, but for the most part seem to be completely made up. Any claims you see like this did not come from us. And the head of Trump's own cybersecurity agency tweeted, "This is not a real thing. Don't fall for it and think twice before you share." And then that cybersecurity agency, as well as a few others, put out a statement that said the November 3rd election was the most secure in American history. There is no evidence that any voting system deleted or lost votes, changed votes, or was in any way compromised. Those are Trump's people. At least they were until he fired his cybersecurity chief today. I wonder why. And by the way, this was Trump's current lead counsel 10 days ago.
In my opinion, there really are no bombshells that are about to drop that will derail a Biden presidency, including these lawsuits. And at the end of the day, in my view, the litigation will not work. It will not reverse this election.
That's his lead counsel. So that doesn't exactly fill you with confidence about Trump's chances. Mind you, none of this means there was no electoral fraud. Only this week, a Texas social worker was charged with 134 counts of fraud after submitting voter registration applications for 67 supported living centre residents without their consent. These being people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So fraud does happen, John, but tens of thousands of votes is a very big gap to bridge. And at least so far, you wouldn't say Trump's team's kicking a lot of goals.
No, indeed not. Meanwhile, President-elect Joe Biden says his preparations to take office in 63 days from now are moving forward despite the president's refusal to concede defeat or allow official transition processes to begin.
Well, I find this more embarrassing for the country than debilitating for my ability to get started.
Although America's top infectious diseases expert, Dr. Anthony Fauci, isn't so sanguine when it comes to a delayed transition in the middle of a pandemic.
It's almost like passing a baton in a race. You don't want to stop and then give it to somebody. You want to just essentially keep going. And that's what transition is. So it certainly would make things more smoothly if we could do that.
So what exactly is involved in the transition from one administration to another? Chris Liu was the executive director of the Obama-Biden transition project after the 2008 election, and he's with us now. Mr. Liu, welcome to Planet America.
Thank you for having me.
What should be happening right now in a presidential transition process that is not happening?
Well, you would have complete cooperation between the outgoing administration and the incoming one. You would have intelligence briefings being given to the president-elect. You would have the president-elect's team making contact with agency officials throughout the federal government and beginning to download information. And it's important to understand what's happening right now is not a partisan food fight. It's historically abnormal. And, you know, in the United States, we have done presidential transitions for over 200 years, and we've done them in war and depression, and often the people on both sides are bitter adversaries, but we always do it. And so this is abnormal, what's happening right now.
What are the limitations on President-elect Biden? Could he be exploring back channels at the moment? Could his COVID advisors be getting Tony Fauci or the CDC on the phone and saying, OK, what are we going to do about this? Can there be an informal process that continues even if the formal transition's not happening?
You know, I think anything is possible, but, you know, Vice President Biden, I should say President-elect Biden, is somebody who wants to follow the rules, who I think hopes that this will soon get resolved and that cooler heads prevail, because, again, it's part of the broader norm of how we do things in this country. Each day that goes by where there is not formal cooperation, I think increases the risk for the country and the American people. And so, you know, I don't want to speculate on what they may do, but you know, hopefully this gets resolved soon.
What if this is not resolved until that mid-December date when the Electoral College will formally vote? Because presumably, you know, if the Trump administration is going to push ahead with drawing down troops from Iraq and Afghanistan, there's a whole bunch of stuff that the law explicitly says Joe Biden can't get involved in, particularly around foreign affairs, that he would be breaking the law if he made, you know, outreach to certain world leaders or talked to people in the military. So he's kind of flying blind, isn't he?
Well, look, I mean, there is only one president at one time, and even if there were full cooperation now as there was in 2008, the president-elect would not be getting involved in the policy decisions of the United States. But you do want to ensure that post-January 20th, that handover happens as easy as possible, and that the new team is fully read into all of the threats that are happening around the world, all of the military operations that are going on. That's simply on the national security side. Even on the domestic side, where we are trying to get our arms around this pandemic, you want to make sure that the new team fully is able to be up and running and continuing the policies that need to happen. So you can do one president at one time and still have an orderly transition.
And of course, Chris Liu, this is all happening in a pandemic. The inauguration itself is going to presumably look very different. There's also the prospect of Donald Trump not even attending. How do you think that is going to impact the start of the Biden administration? Is it going to delegitimize it in any way?
You know, I don't think so, but I will say this. You know, we in this country, as your country as well, we have a proud tradition of this peaceful transfer of power. And I realize it's just symbolism, but traditionally, the president will invite the president-elect into the Oval Office. They'll have a conversation, as President Obama and President-elect Trump did in 2016. Traditionally, before the inauguration ceremonies, the families will sit down together. They'll ride to the ceremonies together. I realize that's all simple and none of it really matters, except it really does matter. It shows that our country's interests are above any person's political interests, and we all work for the good of the country. There's this long tradition of outgoing presidents writing a note and putting it in the Resolute desk in the Oval Office for his successor. It's kind of a hokey tradition, but it's important. It shows that they're part of a longer history of this country. And look, I hope we can sort of get back to that, because I think it is sort of what makes our country unique, and I think it strengthens our democracy, that leaders can look beyond their own interests to something bigger.
Chris Lu, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
Well, there are 5 days to go until the states that matter will have certified their results, and Trump is almost out of time. So is he getting nervous? Well, let's ask him. Mr. President, are you there?
So not nervous at all. The word nervous isn't even in my vocabulary. I had to look it up. I never heard of it. Nervous. Nervous. I thought it was pronounced nervous. I thought it rhymed with moose. That's how much. I'd never heard of it. Anyway, that's the Team Trump update. Thanks for checking in. Don't forget, some of the best wins in history were actually losses.
Well, we seem to have lost the president there, so we'll try again later on. In the meantime, we've been talking the last few weeks about the polls falling short again, but it's really been too early to be sure, because the counting's still going on even now. Well, this is our last show of the year, so it's now or never. Were the critics right about the polls or not? To the wall!
Big, beautiful wall.
Now, the first question is, which pollsters to evaluate? The problem is, even the most respected pollster is capable of an outlier, like, for instance, ABC Washington Post. They're rated A+ by 538. They're as respected as you can get. Yeah, even they came up with a 17-point margin in Wisconsin the week before the election. They were wrong. So I'm going to choose instead to look at 538's polling averages. They not only aggregate all the most respected polls, but they weight the pollsters' results based on their previous track records, as well as a bunch of other factors. It's all designed to smooth out and cover up errors, kind of like how a comb-over can cover up obvious baldness. So, how did 538 do on the popular vote? Well, they predicted an 8-point margin, whereas so far, it's only been a 3.6-point margin in reality, the popular vote. Although, I should say, this number isn't quite finished yet. Most analysts do expect this to end up between 4 and 5 points. So that's, a 3 to 4 point margin, maybe? Whereas 538 reckons the average popular vote polling error since 1972 has actually been 2.3 points. So that's kind of a strike. Okay, let's go to the House. Now, these results aren't finished yet either, but right now it's looking like the Democrats are going to win somewhere between 220 and 226 House seats. So why don't we look at those results on 538's whiz-bang prediction graph. These here are the probabilities that the Democrats could have won this number of seats. So, for instance, 538, they say Democrats had a 3.5% chance of winning 238 seats. Now, the Democrats actually won between 220 and 226 seats. 538 only gave them a 5% chance of winning 220 seats or less, and a 12.5% chance of winning 226 seats or less. So that's not very likely what actually happened. And as far as vote share went, 538 predicted the Democrats would win by a greater than 6-point margin. So far, they've only won by a 2.1% margin, although that number should go up probably to the high 2s eventually. But once again, you wouldn't call all this a huge win for the pollsters, would you? To the Senate. Now, we can go state by state here. In Georgia, 538 predicted an 8.3% win for Republicans on average. whereas there's actually a 1.7% win. Now that's not a bad projection. That's only a 1.4 point error. And then it wasn't bad either. They projected in Colorado the Dems would win by 7.7 points. They actually won by 9.3 points. That's a 1.6 point error. Pretty good. Unfortunately, those errors there, they grew a lot larger than that. There's lots of 5-point errors there, 7-point errors in Montana and Minnesota. Have a look at Maine down the bottom there. It's a 10-point error. Now, the average error from 538 for all those projections was 4.8 points, which actually is smaller than the average Senate polling error since 1998. So well done, I guess. It does make you wonder though, what's the point of polls if they're going to miss by this much? Regardless, there's only one kind of poll that people actually care about. That's presidential polls. Now, for the last few years, there's basically been one major rivalry going on. Normal polling versus a company called Trafalgar. Trafalgar's a polling company that uses its own unique secret method. It supposedly accounts for people who don't tell pollsters their true intentions for fear of being stigmatised or of being politically incorrect. These are the so-called shy Trumpers. Now, Trafalgar's Robert Cahaly, he got the 2016 election almost perfectly right. They weren't quite so good in 2018, but good enough to still attract these kinds of headlines. So, whose approach won in 2020? I declare
Nerd
is simple. We're going to compare their final electoral college projections as well as their final projections for the major swing states. Let's go!
Nerd.
It seems like the Democrats will win 306 electoral college votes, whereas 538 projected an average of 348 electoral college votes for the Dems. That's about a 42 electoral college vote error. But Trafalgar projected only 216 electoral college votes for the Dems. That's 90 electoral college votes off. So 538 wins round one. But now for the state-by-state round. What we're going to do here is compare how large their polling errors were for each swing state. This is the actual margin in each of the swing states so far. The numbers could still change just a little, but they're pretty close to final at this point. Now in Georgia, the Democrats won by 0.3%. 538 projected a 0.9% victory for the Democrats, which is an error of 0.6%, whereas Trafalgar projected a 4.3-point Republican victory, which was a 4.6-point error. And 538 made a 3.7% error in Nevada. Trafalgar made a 3.1% error the other way round. 538 made a pretty large 5.9% error in Florida. Trafalgar almost spot on, and so on. The other big screw-ups, 538 was 7.5 points off in Ohio. Both sides were way wrong in Michigan, and 538 really screwed up Wisconsin. Overall, the average error for 538 was 4.2 points. According to them, the average presidential state polling error since 1998 was 4 points. So that's about right, I guess. However, the average error for Trafalgar was 2.8 points. So Trafalgar has done it again. Look, you can do what you like with these results, but they are what they are. Trafalgar may or may not have the solution, but to me, it does look like conventional polling at least has a problem.
Big, beautiful world.
So, this being our final episode of Planet America for 2020, we're going to be spending a lot less time watching cable news and reading news sites and a lot more time with our feet up at some overpriced holiday rental with nothing but a bunch of dodgy old DVDs to watch. So, this might help us all with that particular transition. Technically, the US election is not over, not because Trump is crying foul, but because it wasn't a direct election. It was for electors to the Electoral College, who will vote for the president and submit that vote to Congress, who then counts it and certifies the result.
Shut the up, Donnie.
Here are the key dates in that process. You can tick them off while we're on holiday. December the 8th is the deadline for states to sort out their slate of electoral college electors. It's called the Safe Harbour Deadline, and any disputes have to be resolved by them. Both parties have nominated a group of faithful electors, so like Hillary Clinton is an elector in New York. Only once in 1796 has an elector voted for the rival candidate that they were elected to. Most states now have laws against faithless electors. Not all, so it is technically possible. Some Trump supporters are still trying to dismiss piles of ballots or get Republican state legislators to ignore the result and install Trump-friendly electors instead. But that is all very, very, very unlikely. On December the 14th, the state electors will meet to cast their votes. On December 23rd, those electoral college certificates from each state are received by Vice President Mike Pence in his role as President of the Senate. On January the 3rd, the new Congress sits for the first time, but without the two senators from Georgia. They'll be elected in the runoff election on January 5. On January 6th, a joint session of the House and Senate will count the electoral votes, and technically, that is the election of the president, right there. 2 weeks later, on January the 20th, the president will be sworn in for a 4-year term in office. Right now, there is absolutely no reason to think that won't be former Vice President Joe Biden. Even with recounts and a few little court cases to be resolved, it's unlikely they will have any effect on the result. This was not a historically close election.
Not even close.
There is no evidence of widespread irregularities. What is historic and irregular is a sitting president refusing to accept the result, concede defeat and allow a full formal transition.
You're right. He was out of line. His behavior is completely unacceptable.
Barring some extraordinary and very irregular intervention from the courts to overturn a clear election result, at midday on January the 20th, Joe Biden will become America's 46th president.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
And at that moment, Donald Trump will join Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush and Barack Obama as a former American president, one with no power other than the influence he retains among his supporters and his party. As President Trump continues to ignore the reality of his defeat, he also seems to be ignoring the reality that in less than a week, more than 1 million Americans have tested positive to the coronavirus. In South Dakota alone, almost 60% of all tests are returning a positive result. Republican Governor Kristi Noem has refused to issue even a public health advice, such as wearing a face mask. Here she is a couple of weeks ago at a Trump rally.
My people are happy. They're happy because they're free.
But according to nurse Jody Daring, the South Dakotans she's seeing are anything but happy.
I think the hardest thing to watch is that people are still looking for something else and they want a magic answer and they don't want to believe that COVID is real. And their last dying words are, this can't be happening, it's not real. And when they should be spending time FaceTiming their families, they're filled with anger and hatred, and it just made me really sad.
The human toll of disinformation. Another state with higher than 50% positive test rate this week, Iowa. And the state's 87-year-old Republican Senator Chuck Grassley has just confirmed this morning he has tested positive for the coronavirus as well. But there is some good news to bring you. A second experimental coronavirus vaccine, this one from Moderna, appears to be around 94.5% effective. That's good. And importantly, Moderna's vaccine is okay with standard refrigeration, while Pfizer's vaccine announced last week needs to be kept basically in a deep freeze of minus 80 degrees.
Yeah, look, it is great news, and doesn't Trump want to take credit for that? He asked all those great historians to please remember that these great discoveries all took place on my watch. You know what? That's fair enough, I think. We could spend all day criticising Trump's response to COVID, and we have, but Operation Warp Speed is one Trump administration initiative that's been a genuine success. The fastest vaccine that's been previously developed has been for the mumps in the 1960s, and that took 4 years. So this is genuinely groundbreaking. And according to the head of Operation Warp Speed, Moncef Slaoui, they aren't messing around.
We plan to have enough vaccine doses available for use in the US population to immunize about 20 million individuals in the month of December, and another 25 to 30 million per month on an ongoing basis from there on.
Although Dr. Fauci has been very careful to note that that does not mean this is all over.
It's not going to be a light switch, Jake. We're not going to turn it on and off, going from where we are to completely normal. It's going to be a gradual accrual of more normality as the weeks and the months go by, as we get well into 2021.
Well into 2021. And that's why these numbers are still worrying. Over 155,000 new cases today alone, and still going up everywhere. And I mean everywhere. 47 out of 50 states are now experiencing uncontrolled spread from COVID. Although some places are worse than others. John mentioned that South Dakota was pushing the 60% mark for the proportion of COVID tests coming back positive. Well, it's not alone. Look at these states. And remember, you want the percent of positive tests to be below 5%. Nationally, that number's going up as well, up to 10% and rising, which is leading to big records in hospitalizations. They're up to 75,000 now, which in some states then creates a worrying shortage in ICU capacity. Montana has literally zero ICU capacity, and Oklahoma isn't far behind. North Dakota's so hard up for doctors that right now they're getting medical workers to keep working even when they've tested positive for coronavirus, as long as they don't show symptoms. And when the hospitals are full, then the deaths really start to rise. Now at over 1,600 deaths just today. That's the highest number since May. And given there's usually a 3-week lag between case spikes and death spikes, December could be terrible in America, John.
Yeah, it's not an ideal situation, Chaz, but I have got some good news. We have got the President back on the line. Mr. President, can you hear us?
Come on, man. That's malarkey. My grandfather used to drive a train to work. Shit.
And that is all for Planet America for this week and for this year. Thanks for watching. We'll be back in 2021 in time for the inauguration.
And we'll have one last fireside chat this Friday on ABC News and a brand new Piping Hot Pet podcast as well right there, right now.
Good night.
Yeah.